Hello and welcome back to another episode of the Warwick F1 Show. Today I'm joined by Chinmay and Callum, and we are looking at the Hungarian Grand Prix, a race that I think is fair to say maybe not the most interesting on track, but the drama that we had over the radio and between some of the drivers was top notch. And we saw Oscar Piastri's first win, taking his first win for McLaren, his first win in F1. But I think it's fair to say it was anything but simple. We saw McLaren have to negotiate with Lando Norris to let Oscar Piastri through, having undercut him on the second round of pit stops. Norris getting in front, and then the team having to negotiate to let Oscar Piastri back through. We'll discuss all of that. And then a bit behind them, we had the drama of Max Verstappen on the radio being very kind of upset with the team's strategy, with the decisions that they'd made, and then obviously colliding, but again colliding with Lewis Hamilton in a move I think that was opportunistic at best. But as we normally do, we start the episode with what we give the race out of 10. I think this is going to be one where you've almost got to kind of consider the whole environment before, as well as just the racing on track. But Chinmay, I'll come to you first. I mean, what would you kind of give that out of 10?
I'll give that a solid 8 out of 10. The on-track action, obviously, with Hungary, always leaves something a little bit to be desired at times because of the fact that you can only really overtake on the first couple of turns of the track. But then, obviously, we had the off-track drama. You know, this actually, to be fair, strategy-wise, it was actually really good because it had high tire deck, so we were looking at a two-stop race and stuff. You know, watching everyone different tire strategies points. Some people, it looked like some drivers might actually have the pace advantage, and then all of a sudden they don't because they burn out their tires too quick. And obviously, not to mention the radio dramas, which is probably going to be the bulk of this episode. So, actually, I'm going to probably rescind that. Probably got 8.5, just because, yes, 8.5, even a 9, because the Hungarian generally doesn't offer too much on-track action, but then off-track, just everything was there. We had the drama, we had everything. Obviously, we didn't have, and especially because we didn't have safety cars, did we have a safety car that actually made everything much more smooth as well and entertaining?
I'd actually be more inclined to not give it as high a rating as that potentially. I think I was thinking of maybe about a 7 or a 7.5 perhaps, just because I think the first half of the race wasn't great. It was mainly just people sort of managing their tyres. There wasn't a lot of overtaking happening. It wasn't until Verstappen fighting through the pack and obviously the radio drama between the McLarens and the mistakes that they made, which again, I'm sure we'll talk about a little bit later. That's when the race kind of started to come alive in a way. But before then, it was pretty much everyone just managing their tyres as far as I'm aware. Piastri was just managing the gap out in front, and to be fair to him, looked quite comfortable. And also, it kind of, I think, for me, left a bit of a sour taste after the race, as if you would have told me before the race that it was going to be Oscar Piastri's first win, you would say, oh, we're going to be ecstatic after the race. But it didn't happen because that was almost overshadowed by everything else that happened. And so that kind of was even though it did provide a lot of drama for the race, it also was in some other ways. I saw it as a bit of a letdown as well. So although a lot of stuff did happen come the end of the race, I think I would have wished a better platform for Oscar to get his first win in Formula One. But it was a pretty good race.
Yeah, I think a 7.5 as well. I think I completely agree. It wasn't maybe the most interesting race at the start. I think we've seen that at quite a few races this season. Maybe they haven't been ones at the start. We think that they're going to turn good, but by the end of it, we definitely did see some drama with Piastri, with Norris, with Verstappen and Hamilton as well. And I think it's hard to base a race off whether you should just take the racing or should you take the kind of whole situation involved, because I think the racing wasn't the best, but the drama that we kind of had was definitely up there with some like the spiciest kind of radio communications we've seen this season. So I think a 7.5 is what I'd go for as well. And we may as well get into it. And I think it's best to start at the front with Piastri and Norris, and obviously everything that happened there. So just for a bit of background, this kind of whole situation starts into the second round of pit stops. McLaren pit Norris to cover off a threat of Hamilton, who was already pit, the undercut being very powerful at Hungary, and then they pit Piastri a few laps later. And because of that powerful undercut, that means that Norris comes out, he's about, I think, 3 seconds ahead of Piastri and has taken P1 on the track. That doesn't tend to be how it works, especially among teammates. The driver who's leading tends to get priority on the pit stop. So obviously McLaren, by kind of letting Norris leapfrog Piastri, put themselves in quite a sticky situation, which they then try and rectify in a way that is eventually turns into a bit of a farce by the end of it. So, I mean, I guess the first question I've got is, did Norris make the right decision? Should he have let Piastri pass? Should he have held his lead? Obviously, he does have to consider the Drivers' World Championship, which the gap is large at the moment, but if McLaren do look as though they've got the best car, it could close very quickly. So did Norris make the right call? And I mean, did he make it in a good time? What do we think?
I think ultimately the verdicts I came with at the end of the race was that it was the right outcome, but it was done in the completely wrong way from the McLaren team point of view. Ultimately, I think if we came away from that race where Norris didn't give the position up, what I would have been thinking was Piastri deserved that win. He had not put a foot wrong that race. He was dominating the race like any other very experienced driver would. Certainly not something you'd expect from a driver who's only in his second season in Formula One. And he's been put into second place through no fault of his own, through a decision made by the McLaren pit crew. And I just think McLaren should have handled it better. Ultimately, I don't think, again, like you said, it's not really Norris's fault. If he's been put in that first place position, then how can you blame him for not wanting to give up that position? It's a race win at the end of the day for someone who's only got one race win himself. I think McLaren needed to handle it a lot better. I don't know what they were thinking with pitting Norris first ahead of Piastri on both occasions, on both pit windows. They knew that the undercut was so powerful around here. Every team knew that going into this race and continuing throughout the race. And I couldn't really understand it from that point of view. And maybe they should have said to Norris, right, we're going to bring you in early, but just to let you know, we expect you to give the position back to Piastri and see if he's okay with that before you go through all this process of bringing Norris in first and then Piastri second. So I think it's largely down to McLaren and the strategy calls from, I don't know what's been happening with McLaren recently. It seems like occasionally they delve into Ferrari territory, but it was very poorly handled by McLaren. And I think ultimately Norris in the end did do, it seems wrong saying the right thing, but from generally point of view, it was the right thing. But then to be fair, Norris probably doesn't understand the full situation from his position when he's being asked to give the place up. So it probably did feel a bit unfair in the moment. But as I said, I think for those reasons, ultimately it was the right conclusion that we came to. But it's just a shame that it's this whole thing that's been overshadowing Piastri's first win, as it didn't really feel like that was the main thing to be celebrating, which ultimately it should have been. But I think at the end, I'm glad we reached the correct conclusion.
Yeah, I think for me, this is 100% on McLaren. This is a complete failure of management of your drivers who, it worked out well. They got their 1-2. Arguably, the driver that should have won did win, but it's just the way it got to there was so poorly managed by the team. I think partially by Lando Norris. I completely understand that he wants to win that race, but I think that if he was kind of caught in two minds. I think if you're going to let him through eventually, it would have been so much better to just do it straight away and not have to have those 20 kind of laps of increasingly desperate radio messages from McLaren saying, oh, it's like starting by save tires in these turns, and then eventually appealing to, if you want to win the championship, you're only going to do it with the team and with Piastri.
It was so embarrassing. It was honestly embarrassing for McLaren. They're deploying the guilt trip tactic on Lando Norris to try and get him to give up the position. And they should have, the other thing is they should have done it probably earlier, not when Norris has gone ahead and he's now 5 seconds up the road. Like, you think that, although I guess they were trying to do it earlier coming out of the pit stops, but it was only until the guilt trip settled. It was really bad, wasn't it?
Yeah, and I mean, it does for me. It puts a stain on Piastri's first win. Like, every driver who's won a race on the grid, be it Ocon at Hungary 3 years ago. You've got Gasly 4 years ago. Obviously, you've now got all of the top all of the top 8 or the top 14, both drivers in their teams, and now obviously Piastri as well. You can remember back to their first wins, like the joy that these drivers felt being able to stand on a top step of the podium, achieving one of the goals that ultimately these drivers have had for their entire lives, to stand on the top step of a Formula One podium and win a race. And for Piastri, that's kind of been tarnished a little bit in that he hasn't really had that full experience. He's been caught up in this scenario that's not in no way his fault, that he's like, and then it doesn't feel, it's not that he's been given the win, but I can imagine for him, and you saw that I think after the race, that he was apologizing for not closing it up, not making kind of the situation easier. It's an awful situation for him to find himself in, and especially when at that point this is his first win. This is one of the pinnacles of his career, and it's kind of been tarnished like that. It's similar to like when Sainz, I think, got his first podium in like Brazil 2019, and he couldn't celebrate it because the penalty was only applied after the race. And it is like he's achieved something really good, but it's just not been done in the way that I think anyone wanted it to be. And I think at the end of the day, you've got to say that's on McLaren. Like, you can't blame anyone else.
Yeah, I'm just fully surprised that Lando's engineer did not mention that he didn't give himself emotional blackness. That, oh, you have to look at Oscar's sad little face when he come out of that car or something like that. But yeah,
I think if there are a few more laps, that might have been what it would have come to. But I think he gave the place up before he resorted to that measure.
Yeah. No, but honestly, I think, to be honest, this has kind of gave me vibes of, I believe, 2019 Singapore, when we're talking about Sebastian Vettel's last F1 win, where admittedly it was a little bit fortunate where Ferrari actually prioritized Vettel's strategy over Leclerc, even though Leclerc was actually in front during that race. Because I remember Leclerc was, because obviously at that point Ferrari didn't say anything for Vettel to, for any team orders or anything. And Leclerc was very visibly frustrated during that race as well. But yeah, I guess this is what happens when you do hire ex-Ferrari strategists to your team and you start dominating. Yeah.
I think for me, again, and we spoke about it last week at Britain, or 2 weeks ago at Britain, and I think it's very much been reinforced again this week. McLaren still aren't. Then they've got a car that can win championships, but I don't think at the moment they are a championship winning team. They just haven't got the management. Like, I think obviously we've got Red Bull and Mercedes who have won championships. I think Ferrari have been kind of in this situation, but they're now getting there under Fred Vasseur, even if they've dropped back for the last few races. I think what you're seeing with McLaren is just they don't they almost seem shocked that they're at the front, and they're so like scared of making mistakes or so scared of maybe making the tough calls that then that costs them in the end, and then they end up in situations where it's far worse for them in the long run. And I think they've still got to kind of develop that mentality of that we're like the mentality of we're at the front and we're gonna win this race. And that mentality, like Mercedes have got it, Red Bull have got it, Ferrari have got it, because Ferrari have always had it for the past like 50 years or so, 60 years now. McLaren need that again, and they had it. Well, they had it obviously when they were winning in the 2000s and maybe the early 2010s, but they've lost it and they need it back. And at the moment, I don't think they've got it.
It's weird that we even kind of sat here talking about that in a way, because if you think about this race, it's been a McLaren 1-2, and their main rivals, I suppose, for, well, the championship, if you can even call it a championship rivalry at the moment, which I don't think you can. It's been a horrible day for them. Perez being not great in qualifying. He was all right in the race, but only got to P8, obviously, and Verstappen making mistakes and dropping back down to P5. It should have been a brilliant day for McLaren, and ultimately, from a points perspective, it has, but it's been overshadowed by these mistakes that they keep making, and maybe why it's almost the reason why I still don't think, even though people think, because a lot of people made the argument that like maybe Norris should stay in front because of his championship battle with Verstappen, but I don't think we're anywhere near that. Even if McLaren were close on points, I still think that, and it's still why I think you favour someone like Mercedes or Verstappen to win, because you just know that they have that experience of winning behind them. And like you say, it's the same thing we were talking about in Silverstone. And so, yeah, ultimately they do need to, they're getting there, and it's the road to recovery in getting back to consistent winning. But they're still, I think, a little bit off yet, in a way.
I think it's a lack of edge. Like Mercedes when they were winning, there were times maybe it wasn't managed as well, but then they'd go after the race and they'd put the hammer down. Like you think to Lauda, when he was managing, obviously between Hamilton and Rosberg, and then you've got Red Bull, who their clear number one driver is Verstappen. They know the situation, and Verstappen will be prioritised. And I think Ferrari is just, it's the team above the drivers. Like the team is the important factor. You are driving for the team, you're not driving for yourself. And if the team says do something, you'll do it. At the moment, McLaren there's no edge. I don't think they needed to come onto the radio. If they wanted to swap the positions, come onto the radio as soon as possible, say, Lando, you're ahead, but we didn't intend to. Please invert the positions. Now, none of this, oh, you're going too fast, please save the tyres. None of this, oh, think of the team, can't win without a team. It's not like don't beat around the bush kind of thing. Like, you want them to swap positions, say swap positions, and then if Norris doesn't do that, after a while, then that's when it can get more and more strict. And it was always like it's like they didn't want to upset anyone. Like, you're gonna have to upset someone here. You needed to do that.
I don't know what happens when McLaren think that I don't know what McLaren thinks happens when a driver saves their tyres. It's not that they drop 5 seconds off the pace in about 5 laps, but that's certainly, unless it was some kind of encoded message to him, which Norris should have understood. But it was very strange, wasn't it? In the different manners that they tried to put it, and got increasingly more guilt tripping and intensive, I suppose.
I think it will cost them wins at some point. I mean, what do you think, Chinmay?
Well, yeah. Well, as long as we don't see anything between the likes of Lando is faster than you, can you confirm you understand this message? Only those sort of random so-called encoded messages. But Yeah, I feel like, again, McLaren just have a tendency to panic in these sort of times. And yeah, I guess it's just what it is at the end of the day. They've got to try and keep both drivers happy as well, and then whilst avoiding these sort of situations if at all possible. But
Yeah. And
yeah.
if I may, I'll bring it up quickly. Do you think that this is all avoided if I think I don't want to criticize Norris, but again, if Norris comes out of turn one in the lead, he wins that race. And this is now the fifth time he's he's put it on pole in either a sprint or a normal race and isn't in the lead by the end of lap one. Like, it's 5 out of 5 now. Do you think that there is something there? Because I think for me, like, when you see a Verstappen on pole or a safety car restart, there's no way he's not kind of going into turn one in the lead. But it almost feels like now, if Norris gets the pole, you're almost thinking, oh, who's kind of gonna overtake him? I mean, do you think that's just bad luck, or do you think that there's something there as well?
No, I do think it's a little bit of not. I don't want to say lack of skill, but obviously he has all the talent in the world. But it's a problem for him going forward if he's wanting to fight for consistent race wins, because I think I was at that point on the Saturday where he gets pole and you think, yeah, but that it's happened before. It's happened so many times before where he's got lots of poles this season and he's only got one race win, which he was in a way he got a bit lucky with. So he does need to kind of get into that way, in a way what Piastri did of managing the race. And because ultimately, I think you wouldn't have been forgiven in thinking that if Piastri was pitted first, then he could have easily controlled that race from start to finish, just like we saw with Verstappen last season, like we saw with Hamilton for so many times during the Mercedes era, where you just dominate the race completely. And that is Norris's loss at the end of the day. He was at pole position in at the start of the race, and so yeah, I think that's certainly something that he needs to improve in his racecraft in a way. I mean, ultimately, you're going to have some bad luck with the start anyway, but it's happened one too many times now. With Russell in, I think it was Spain, wasn't it? And now again. So yeah, it's certainly something that he's going to want to improve on, and I'm sure he knows this, but it's something that needs to change if he wants to be consistently fighting for wins at McLaren.
Yeah, and I think it is the fact that probably since Imola, he could have won every single race, maybe with the exception of Monaco, regardless of where he's kind of qualified. And he's won one of them, and as you say, Callum, that was one in which he kind of did get a bit luckier in terms of how he won it. And I mean, I think we spoke about it in Britain as well. Do you think there is that winning, like McLaren haven't got kind of that management instinct of dealing with two drivers at the front? Do you think Norris still needs to develop kind of that winning instinct? And maybe, do you think that if he'd kind of held that position, if he'd stayed in P1, if he'd been a bit ruthless, that could have been a springboard kind of two maybe wins at Belgium or wins after the summer break?
I don't think it's a case of ruthlessness in a way. I mean, I'm sure he has. I'm sure he's perfectly willing to defend with everything he has to defend a race win. I think it's just not. I think it's just not being the best starter, and he just seems to get completely swamped in the first kind of 50, 100 meters of the start of the race with, I mean, Russell obviously being able to make massive ground up on him in Spain, and then Piastri was able to get by a little bit off track in this race. And so I think it's just a case of that. I think Norris, we have no doubt that Norris has the talent, but maybe like you say, he's just not used to winning. And I think he'll have an element of disappointment in these past few races, as we've mentioned, because he should have won more than one realistically, I think. And it's certainly not all down to him. There's obviously been quite a few bad strategy calls from McLaren. But yeah, he just needs that something else. It's just something missing from that McLaren team, whether it's from Norris's racecraft or the McLaren strategy or something else that is just required to take that next step onto consistent winning that you see, and really highlights how difficult it is to be a team like Mercedes or Red Bull that win week in, week out, because you need a lot of components to go right consistently. And it's just one or two things for McLaren, but nevertheless, it is something missing.
Yeah. And I think we'll move on now. And speaking of Red Bull, and their number one driver, Max Verstappen had, I think, an eventful race. It can be described as, obviously started third on the grid. We saw him have to give up the position to Norris. He complained about that. Then he was undercut by Hamilton, and he complained about that. Then he was undercut by Leclerc. Then he complained about that. Then he overtook Leclerc, tried to overtake Hamilton, collided with Hamilton, and then complained about that, and was just generally kind of complaining about the strategy for the entire race. And I think it's fair to say this was probably Verstappen's worst race of the season, Chinmay. Like just overall, in terms of just everything that went on, it was really not kind of a performance he'll probably look back on and think that was a good one.
Literally, all he needed was a bad pit stop for it to be the complete package of bad race. But to be fair, Red Bull was quite poor with their decision making, and strategy wise, there's not much Max could do. Really, Verstappen could really do about that. But then obviously, even when things couldn't have got worse, he decided to randomly dive bomb Lewis Hamilton, who obviously very respectfully shut the door on Max because that was Lewis's corner. Max goes flying again. I guess he just took the slogan of Red Bull a bit too seriously. Actually got a bit of wings for a split second, and yeah, that was his race ruined, and I don't know how he didn't get a penalty for that, but...
No, I did enjoy some of the personal highlights of the radio conversations were, so we can force another driver off track now, because just that's the Verstappen special, is forcing another driver off the track. We had, what else did we have? We had the GP, and I think just ended up getting very fed up with him, called him childish after we had the dive bomb. Max kind of swearing all over the radio about the strategy, which to be fair, was kind of warranted. It wasn't the best strategy in the world. Would it be controversial to say Sergio Perez had a better race?
I'd fully agree with that. I would fully agree with that.
At least Perez actually did a decent recovery drive.
No, I was going to say if we didn't mention it as a topic, that some credit should be given to Perez, because he's actually, if you forget the poor performance in qualifying, he's actually done quite a decent recovery drive. But it's just, I think Verstappen is just reminded of what it's like for the rest of the grid when you're not consistently winning, and it's so disrespectful, isn't it? It's to a team that has been so generous to him over the past couple of seasons, and they mess up one strategy even a little bit. It wasn't a disaster from them, I'd say. It just wasn't their day, ultimately. But he's just reacted to that in such a, to quote his race engineer, in such a childish manner, like he's a rookie or certainly not someone who has 3 world championships. It was very strange just from Verstappen in general, with not just his racecraft, but also just his attitude towards the car and the team as well. And it's certainly not something that he's going to want to recall anytime soon, and certainly something he's going to want to sweep under the rug, something that Red Bull is going to want to sweep under the rug. for the rest of the season, I would say.
Yeah, and I mean, on the incident with Hamilton, that's probably the kind of peak or climax of the kind of whole race for Verstappen. Just for context, Verstappen comes from quite far back, does just dive bomb, locks up, and then Hamilton does kind of turn into the corner, the tyres kind of hit, and Verstappen does, I think, if we call it the Rocket League maneuver now, because I feel like we've seen that quite a few times of cars hitting tyres and then getting flipped up.
It's not even the first time. It's not even the first time for Hamilton and Verstappen. They did the exact same thing to take each other out in, was it Monza in 2021? And so yeah, they're obviously used to that kind of flying action in a way.
I mean, would you think, was it a penalty for you? I mean, on the comms, I think everyone kind of, there was a general more penalty than no penalty kind of thing. And obviously, for context, it was deemed a racing incident at the end of it.
I think it was. I would have given a penalty. At the end of the day, Hamilton has done nothing wrong. He's taken the corner as he normally would have, and he's been hit by a mistake from Verstappen, which was very much not... It was very much avoidable. So, in my mind, Verstappen has caused a collision. I guess if you use the proper wording that the stewards would use, in a way, you could say he has caused a collision by making the mistake of either diving it down the inside too late and forcing himself to lock up. And so I would have given him a penalty, which would have been, as they didn't reach a verdict until after the race, which is still annoying, but that's a topic for another day. They could give him a grid drop penalty for the next race in Spa, but yeah, I think it's a penalty in my eyes. It's certainly a mistake on Verstappen's side.
Yeah, I think, well, as a Hamilton fan, I'm probably not the most unbiased source here, but I think, yeah.
No, you're right. You're right on this occasion. It's fine. Don't worry. To defend Hamilton.
It is. I don't see why it isn't a penalty. I think they said that both drivers, or Hamilton, could have done more to avoid the collision. But the way he could have avoided the collision, like, how is he meant to avoid the collision much more than that?
You did actually call it as well on the group chat by saying, "I bet you Verstappen doesn't get a penalty for this," and he didn't.
I think it's another case of prosecuting the consequence as opposed to the action, because I think let's say Hamilton's taken out by that. Let's say they both Verstappen takes Hamilton out of the race. I'm 99% sure Verstappen would end up with a grid drop for Belgium. Like.
No, 100%.
I think it's too much. There's too much, and this is a conversation we've had since 2021. There's too much emphasis on what happens, what happens after, as opposed to what happens. And I just personally, I don't agree with that. That shouldn't be how it is stewarded. And I think that a lot of people have they've kind of brought up the Norris dive bomb, where Verstappen turns out of the corner, Norris doesn't make it. But at the end of the day, that's not a collision, because, I mean, Verstappen does avoid the collision and is forced off the track. So perhaps maybe that's where the stewards are coming from with saying that Lewis maybe could have avoided the collision a bit more, but it's a difficult one. I do understand why the stewards take their time with these things and maybe do come to the decisions that they do. But I just think, again, there's a lack of kind of consistency in some of these. And I think that could perhaps be improved in some aspects.
No, certainly. I think, like you say, if Hamilton does go off, then, and we've seen examples of probably exactly the same thing that's happened where drivers have gotten a penalty. I think Verstappen did something similar. Was it on Vettel in China in 2018? And I don't know if Verstappen actually did get penalised for that, but it's yeah, that's what you're asking for, really, is the consistency in the decision making process, and it certainly didn't seem fair to me in that moment. Interestingly, Hamilton did actually defend that it was maybe a racing incident, which I was quite sceptical. I thought he could very easily build a case out of that, but he obviously didn't fancy it. So,
well, Hamilton this race was such a vibe because just there was chaos going on around him. He was just like poofling along to P3. I respect that so much.
He had a very calm race actually compared to his competitors, I'd say.
I think it was a really good race from Hamilton. I think P3 outperformed perhaps where he should have finished. And like the Mercedes is much better than it used to be, but it was in no way competing with the McLarens. And I do think Verstappen was better or had a better car on the day, and Hamilton did well to kind of hold him back and I guess force Verstappen into moves where he did have to make mistakes, because he had another one at I think it was turn 2 or turn 3, where he went up the inside but ran wide onto the marbles and Hamilton was able to get back through. I think that it was a good race from Lewis Hamilton. I think another podium, now 200, and just an impressive drive.
Yeah, no, especially his defensive driving was really, really good, because obviously when he had the first duel with Verstappen and because obviously Lewis had cooked his tyres pretty much by pushing a bit too hard, so Verstappen was right on his tail. But then I guess Lewis took the lessons from that Alonso defensive drive from a few years back when Lewis could not even overtake even in that Mercedes. That I think was the 2020
2021 Mercedes.
Yeah, when even then he just could not get past Alonso, and yeah, like I said, there's nothing much more to add. But I just had to say we saw some old Lewis defensive proper driving there, so kudos for that.
Yeah, I think that result was the best Hamilton could probably hope for. Anyone else on the grid we want to talk about? I think it was a fairly uneventful race, kind of nearer the back. I think the Aston Martins also had some team orders drama. I think Stroll was let past to have a go at Yuki Tsunoda by Alonso and then didn't give Alonso the position back. So apparently the team orders bug is infecting the rest of the grid. But have we got anyone else we want to talk about?
Just an interesting point on Mercedes forgetting to fill the car up with fuel on the Saturday. That's not something from a team you'd expect from a team that has won 7 world championships overall, is it? That was a very odd. I don't think we've ever seen that before in F1, certainly in a while, certainly since I've been watching, and it seemed very peculiar. And ultimately, that's why Russell was pretty much out of the race for a lot of it. And it seems quite disappointing for Mercedes, as they could have gotten a lot more points this race. I think if they had 2 cars up there, just very peculiar. Ultimately,
I think I've seen it. I think it's happened a few times before, and it does tend to be when like the track is drying. They just don't think it's going to dry as much. I think Mercedes were just caught out. I mean, anyone else? Yuki Tsunoda had a good race. I think the Aston Martins were back on a little bit more of form. Other than that, everyone was it was a bit processional nearer the back. It was kind of boosted up at the front by all the drama that took place.
I think maybe it was you mentioned Yuki Tsunoda. I think it's kind of the race that he needed in a way to give him a bit of a break. He has in the last few races been, I'd say, underperforming, not really where the potential that we know he can. Some races he's even been outbeaten by Ricciardo, which is obviously quite embarrassing. So I think it's the race that he needed to give him kind of a break and a good performance out of what has been kind of maybe a disappointing middle of the season for him, and hopefully he can now take this into Spa and deliver at the pace that we know he's capable of.
Yeah, one more race before the summer break. And before we move on to Belgium, the final race before the summer break, we have to look at our predictions for Hungary. And Callum, I believe you have the scores on the doors at the moment. It's pretty close. It's looking pretty close.
Yeah, so it's so Will Biddles obviously unfortunately couldn't be here today. So he's currently in front on 78, and then Chinmay is very close behind on 77, and Will Kingswood a little bit further back, but still in the running on 74. So it's still all to play for. So those are the scores before Hungary, and now shall I go over my top five?
Yep, if you want to go first.
Yeah, so I predicted a 1-2, but it was the wrong 1-2. I thought it was going to be a Mercedes 1-2 led by Russell, and that prediction pretty much came crashing down from the Saturday. So Russell obviously wasn't anywhere near the top five, and Hamilton was P3, so that's 1 point. I said he was P2. I said Verstappen would be third place on the podium. I thought that Mercedes were potentially capable of actually outscoring him on pure pace and not through some incident, which is obviously what happened. So 1 point for Verstappen. Then I said Norris in P4. He was obviously P2. And I said Sainz in P5, and he was P6?
6 in the end, yeah.
P6, yeah. So that is, so that's no points for him. So that is 3 points for my top five in total. And do you want me to go through my 1, 2, and 3 point predictions as well?
Yep.
So my 1 point was that Perez does not reach Q3, and I was absolutely correct on that. My 2 point prediction was a musician flies the flag. Did we actually see who flew the flag at the Hungarian Grand Prix?
I don't recall who flew the flag. Let me see if I can find it while you read out your 3 point.
Okay, yeah, we'll come back to that. And then my 3 point prediction was that a car flips over, and as far as I'm aware, I think all cars stayed the right way up throughout the duration of the race. So that's only 1 point, potentially another 3 points, so 4 or 6 points depending on who flew the flag at Hungary. But yes, that was me covering for Will Biddles.
You almost had it in qualifying with Tsunoda, who seemed to jump in the air. Did we figure out why Tsunoda had that kind of jump?
Did he just? I don't know actually. Did he just get on the grass or went over? I think he was transitioning from, was it some runoff to some grass, and maybe there was like a curb or something that he just used as a jump in a way.
I think he just lost control, and he just went a bit wide or something like that. I think it was something like that.
Anyway, Chinmay, did you want to? I was gonna say, if we were still looking, do we want to do?
Chinmay's
1, 2, 1. Predictions.
My best. I don't think it was anyone famous. I can't see anything here.
I'll take that as conceding the 2 points then, unfortunately.
Okay.
So yeah, that would be 4 points overall. So really not a good showing for me. Apologies to Will Biddles.
Okay, so should I do mine then? Quickly? Yep, so for my top five, I've got all five were correct, but in the wrong order. So I predicted a Norris victory, Verstappen second, Piastri third, Hamilton fourth, and Leclerc fifth. But obviously, like I said, it was actually Piastri, Norris, Hamilton, Leclerc, Verstappen instead. So I did get 5 points from that, but which is good. My 1 pointer was, I said there will be 7 teams in Q3. There were actually 6 teams in Q3. So I didn't get my 1 pointer. My 2 pointer I did get there because Ricciardo did outqualify Tsunoda because Tsunoda's crash, and I think Ricciardo was 9th. And my 3 pointer was that Perez loses to both Williams cars, which he beat both. So I believe my total from this weekend will be 7.
7 points, not bad. And I went for, because I was left with it, surprisingly, I went for Verstappen P1, despite being the third person to pick, and the curse has continued. Verstappen didn't. But no, so I went Verstappen P1, that's 1 point there. I did have Norris in P2, so that is 3 points for me. Piastri in P3, so another point. And then Hamilton and Leclerc P4 and P5 were P3 and P4 in the end. So again, like Chinmay, all five of the drivers correct, but I did have Norris in the correct position. So that is 7 points for the top five. For my 1, 2, and 3 point predictions, I went for no surprises in the top 7 for my 1 point prediction. Is Perez a surprise? I will leave this up to you.
Oh, this is debatable, actually. Are we saying after his qualifying? Because I'd say after his qualifying, him finishing in the top 7 is maybe a surprise, but I'd maybe allow that for a 1 point prediction.
Okay. Thank you. I was willing to concede, but if you both
I'd say it's a surprise. With Perez's recent performances, 100% surprise.
Okay, I will be willing to concede that because I think, again, after quali, I was quite surprised to see Perez in P7 in the end, especially around the track that's maybe a bit more difficult. So unfortunately, no 1 point prediction there. My 2 point also didn't come through. I went for double Aussie points, so both Piastri and Ricciardo scoring. Piastri holding up his end of the bargain with the win, but Ricciardo not quite making it. I think saying after the race his strategy wasn't the best. And then my 3 point prediction was a 2019 strategy repeat and success. So a driver behind pits and then comes up to overtake the driver in front with the tyre offset, and as far as I'm aware, that didn't happen either. A few offsets, but no stuck behind and then pits. So no 1, 2, and 3 point predictions there, but 7 points from the top 5. So I think that's closed up the gap a little bit. I think Chinmay might have taken a 2 point lead, as far as I'm aware.
Probably.
Yeah, and then I think I've closed the gap to Will. Should be about 1 point now. So bit closer together. And yeah, anyone else got any final words they want to say?
2024 has now, 6 race winners and
7
race winners, and Perez is not one of them. I'll just leave that there.
Yeah, most race winners since 2012. Verstappen's on his longest run without a win in 3 years, which is slightly concerning because that run is 3 races long.
Oh my, that is. At least we're at the end of it. We're not at we're through the bad times, and it's getting better before the 2026 regulations puts us back to the start again. But it's
when Aston Martin make the best car in existence, and Alonso wins his 3rd world title at the age of like 43
as long as it's not Stroll, then that's fine. I don't even mind.
Well, we'll have to wait and see for 2 years. But we'll be back next time previewing the Belgian Grand Prix, as I said, final race before the summer break, making our predictions for the race at Spa. But for now, thank you to Chinmay, thank you to Callum for coming on. I've been your host, Will Kingswood, and thank you for listening.